My name is Bill Kirby, and I teach in our history department on this side of the Charles River and in Harvard Business School on the other side of the river. It's a great honor to be here and an honor to do so. I was one of the first directors of our Asia Center, and I could not imagine at that time that we would put together a program this extraordinary. And I want to thank the Asia Center for the ambition and the organization to put on such an important conference on such a complex set of topics. Let me just start with one story. I was, in 2003, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, just having started in that role. And Premier Wen Jiabao was coming to Harvard, and I was to be his host. And his people wanted to have his lecture given in Memorial Hall, where President Jiang Zemin had recently spoken. But at the time and place where he wanted to speak in Sanders Theater, the largest class in Harvard College was scheduled to meet by Professor Michael Sandel on justice. And so I called up Professor Sandel. I said, Michael, do you mind moving your class for the Premier of China? And he said, yes, I do mind. I won't do it. But the Premier is welcome to come and talk about justice to my class. The Chinese side said, no, thank you. And then we offered them the second largest place at Harvard University, which is Memorial Church. But Memorial Church had recently been visited, and I had the honor of hosting His Holiness the Dalai Lama recently. So this was not the right territory either, and they end up speaking over at Harvard Business School. Sounds right. But I had chaired His Holiness's visit to Memorial Church earlier that fall because I had initially invited His Holiness in my former capacity as head of the Asia Center, which was the host of that gathering. And I recall introducing His Holiness as, and I quote here, a scholar and teacher who has received tenure in realms far beyond our control. And His Holiness's visit remains for me the single most moving and impactful event that I have witnessed in my more than 30 years on the Harvard faculty. Well, our panel is to discuss His Holiness the Dalai Lama and geopolitics, including the politics of succession and reincarnation. Recent years, as I'm sure most of you in this room know much better than me, have seen the publication of a large number of studies, in particularly looking at how the Manchus viewed and validated succession of the Dalai Lama. And we've heard this morning of Mongol perspectives as well. And I trust we will hear also equally well of Tibetan perspectives. And as we look to the future, which is in part what this panel is about, how might things proceed? We have the precedent of the 10th Panchen Lama, originally a Chinese selected candidate, who would in time become a revered Tibetan leader when he emerged as a defender of Tibetan rights and interests. Will that be the case? We have also the unhappy precedent of the dual recognition of the 11th Panchen Lama, the fate of the first choice of which remains unknown. What are the hopes and fears in Beijing today? During his tenure on the Politburo Standing Committee, Yu Zhengsheng noted at a meeting in Lhasa that Beijing really won't know if its approach to Tibet policies have been successful until the passing of the Dalai Lama. This, he said, will be the test. And this may be a sentiment more widely shared than otherwise known, echoed by others in the Policy Committee, including a gentleman, Professor Jigme at the Zhongyang Dangxiao at the Central Party School, who gave an interview recently in Hong Kong condemning the prevailing Tibetan policy and arguing for a return to talks with representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Happily, as a historian largely of China, I am Waihang in this area, not as deeply versed in the nuances of these debates as our extraordinary panel is today. We have a terrific panel to begin to discuss these and other issues. And to start us off, and I will not give the full introductions as you have their biographies here, let me turn to Jigme Yeshi of the University of Calcutta. Jigme.
Thank you, Professor Kirby, as well as I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, especially Losa Singela for providing me with this opportunity. My presentation is titled Compassion in Praxis, the Life and Legacy of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. At the outset, it should be mentioned that talking about the life and legacy of His Holiness is truly an impossible task, especially condensing it within the time limit that has been provided. Nonetheless, this presentation takes a mode of analyzing his life and legacy through the notion of compassion. As was discussed in the first session in the morning, the Dalai Lamas are termed as emanation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, or Arya Avalokiteshvara Cherisi, an important deity of Tibetan Buddhism, who had delayed his own liberation until he had rescued all the afflicted beings in the world. Taking this idea as the cue, the current 14th Dalai Lama is seen to be truly bringing about what I term as compassion in praxis. He has dedicated his life spreading the values and ideas of compassion. Thus, his life and legacy can be understood as being motivated by the core principles of compassion, which has been put into action through his 4 principal commitments. This presentation will focus on these principal commitments of the Tibetan leader. However, it needs to be understood that his life and legacy is enormous, and a focus on these commitments is only to aid us with this particular presentation. Now, the 4 commitments of His Holiness are as follows. The first commitment is promoting fundamental human values based on a universal or secular approach to ethics. He is concerned with encouraging people to be happy, and he advocates the cultivation of warm-heartedness and human values such as compassion, forgiveness, tolerance, contentment, and self-discipline. In this, he has given importance to how secular ethics can be a primary medium for achieving this goal. Now, using the term secular makes these values acceptable for all, which is the primary objective of His Holiness. His Holiness has initiated several programs and projects to accomplish his first commitment. For instance, which we discussed in the morning, the Mind and Life dialogue, which began from 1987 and which can be termed as the institutionalization of the conversation between Buddhism and science. According to Thupten Jimba, a long-time translator to His Holiness and the co-founder of the Compassion Institute, who attended the first dialogue, the exchange between Buddhism and science held exciting promise for mutual enrichment. These dialogues, numbering more than 30, emerged from a meeting of 3 visionaries: His Holiness, then we have a scientist, Francisco Varela, and philosopher, as well as Adam Engel, a lawyer and entrepreneur. The main objective of His Holiness regarding a dialogue between Buddhism and science is to create a positive change in the world. In the 6th Mind and Life conference held from October 27 to 31, 1998, he stated that the dialogue between science and Buddhism was to form a joint effort between material development and internal spiritual development. Through establishing a dialogue between science and Buddhism, His Holiness is seen to be deriving agency for Buddhism as an epistemology that occupies the same space as the Western knowledge system, which includes science. Though through establishing a dialogue between the two, His Holiness has attempted to invert the hegemony that science exercises, because dialogue normally takes place on equal footing. In this context, he introduced the phenomena of people, which again we discussed in the morning, of accomplished meditators whose bodies remain fresh for some days after clinical death. This, as we know as Thugdam, scientists have yet no explanation for this observable occurrence, but a project has been set to look into it, which we got more information in the morning session. The Tibetan leader believes in the transformative agency that is present in education. He has called for including compassion in modern education, which should be taught not as a religious subject, but as a way to foster inner peace and learn greater human values. This idea of His Holiness is seen to have been incorporated in the happiness curriculum, which was started by the local government of Delhi. The new happiness curriculum involves periods of meditation, mindfulness, and training in universal human values. It was launched by His Holiness in 2018. On an international level in 1998, the Social, Emotional, and Ethical Learning, a K-12 education program, developed for international use, was established through the efforts of His Holiness and Emory University. The program conveys a universal, non-sectarian, and science-based approach to bringing the ethical development of the whole child into education, an approach that has been advocated by His Holiness. On the 22nd of May, 2024 recently, the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh signed a letter of intent to implement the same, the SEE learning across all government schools in the state. Now, the second principle of His Holiness is completely linked to the first principle, which is to encourage harmony among the world's religious traditions. He strongly believes that all major world religions have the potential to create good human beings. He further encourages religious traditions to respect one another and recognize the value of their respective traditions. To fulfill his second commitment, he has participated as well as organized several interfaith dialogues. As early back as 1986, he had participated in a day of prayer for peace that had been organized by the Pope in Assisi. His Holiness's commitment to religious harmony and interfaith dialogue has brought a positive impact in the Himalayas. Now, when we talk about the Himalayas, his ties to the Himalayas is extremely important and also bears much significance in terms of the reincarnation of the Dalai Lamas. Because, as we all know, the 6th Dalai Lama was born in Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh. Now, with regard to this idea of interfaith dialogue and religious harmony, this is specifically seen in the context of Ladakh, a region in the northwest of the Indian Himalayas, which has a majority Buddhist population with the presence of a sizable Muslim community. Every time he visits Ladakh, His Holiness makes it a point to visit members of the Muslim community. For instance, in 2022, in a landmark visit to Ladakh, he accepted an invitation to meet the members of the Muslim community in the predominantly Zanskar district, which is a predominantly Buddhist district. During his interactions with them, he mentioned how he encouraged people to cultivate interreligious harmony. He also stated that in Zanskar, Muslims and Buddhist communities live in close harmony with each other, for which he thanked the Muslims. The Dalai Lama's legacy with regard to interfaith harmony is seen to have yielded a positive result in 2018, when Buddhists and Muslims from Zanskar presented a written pledge to him, vowing to address the past 6 years of communal tension and to embrace a harmonious future by promoting interfaith harmony. The communal flare-up had actually started in 2012 when some Buddhists had converted to Islam. The Zanskar Buddhist Association, which suspected the conversions to be forced, had threatened riots and had observed a strike. The pledge had been submitted to the Tibetan leader by representatives from both the communities, and according to one of the representatives, it was completely due to His Holiness's vision and compassion that enabled them to reach to this milestone, for which they were forever in debt. To carry forward this pledge, a peace committee, which we see in the picture, of 6 representatives from the 2 religions had been established. In 2019, he sponsored and funded a first ever national level Muslims conference titled Celebrating Diversity in the Muslim World in New Delhi. While the initiative actually came from the Muslims of Ladakh, it was well attended by representatives and leaders of various Muslim communities in India. Now, the goal was to recognize and promote inter-community harmony amongst the Muslims in South Asia. His emphasis on religious harmony is not only confined to his adoptive homeland, India, and his numerous visits abroad have also stressed on the need for religious harmony, for which he has participated in several interfaith dialogues. For example, in 2020, the Tibetan leader participated in an online Islam Buddhist forum that had been organized by the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia and the Tibetan Buddhist Center. In 2023, the representatives from the Muslim Youth Movement of Malaysia visited the Dalai Lama in Dharamshala, India, and discussed about promoting religions as tools of peace. Hence, a major legacy of His Holiness is building religious harmony and interfaith peace in the world. With communal and faith-based violence increasing in different parts of the world, many of which, as we know, are spearheaded by religious leaders, his commitment towards interfaith dialogue and religious harmony is truly the need of the hour. His third commitment is directly related to his life, and it pertains to him being a Tibetan. And as the Dalai Lama, he is the focus of the Tibetan people's hope and trust. Therefore, he is committed to preserving Tibetan language and culture, the heritage Tibetans received from the masters of India's Nalanda University, while also speaking for the protection of Tibet's natural environment. Now, His Holiness has faced daunting challenges, as his homeland, as we all know, was taken over by the PRC in 1950-51. Due to a paucity of time, this presentation will not delve into this particular part. However, even under much duress, the Dalai Lama did try to bring about reforms inside Tibet, which in many cases were thwarted by the communist state. As a part of the nation-building project, the newly formed PRC under the leadership of Mao and the communists decided to liberate Tibet, which actually meant the Chinese occupation of the Tibetan regions. Since 1959, he along with thousands of Tibetan refugees have remained in exile in India, Nepal, as well as Bhutan. They have also migrated to other Western countries, and it was due to the initial efforts of His Holiness that Tibetan refugee settlements were successful and could sustain the growing refugee population. His Holiness also brought reforms to the exile administration with the introduction of democratic institutions such as a legislature and eventually a popularly elected executive. He also made the provision for the Tibetan legislature to be able to remove the Dalai Lama from office given a two-thirds majority in favor. In 2011, as was discussed a while back, His Holiness renounced his political role entirely with the election of a Sikyong, or president of the CTA. The strategies adopted by His Holiness for Tibet, from complete independence in the 1960s and 70s to genuine autonomy for Tibet under the middle way approach, also stems from his desire for peace and harmony for Tibetans as well as Chinese. His Holiness's life is a message of dedication to humanity and especially to his people. This is reflected in the importance he has given to educating the Tibetan refugee children, which has resulted in the establishment of several schools and higher education institutions for Tibetan refugees in all the Tibetan settlements in India as well as in Nepal. Now, a significant part of His Holiness's life is religion, especially Buddhism. His Holiness terms himself as a simple monk, and it is through this identity that he is globally known. The global popularity of Tibetan Buddhism is actually due to his efforts. Because under his guidance, several monasteries, nunneries, as well as temples have been built in India as well as in other countries. These institutions are home to thousands of monks and nuns who are involved in the pursuit of a spiritual life and religious training. His Holiness has also given importance to the education and training of nuns, and from 2012, through his efforts, the nuns received the Geshe degree, which is equivalent to a PhD in theology. Also, with the reduction in a number of monks and nuns from the Tibetan refugee community, these institutions have become educational sites for the Himalayan Buddhist communities. Now, a significant legacy of His Holiness is the intra-religious harmony that has been achieved in the exile community as well as the larger Buddhist world. His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama has received teachings from all other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, making him into one of the important ecumenical or Reme masters of our time. Now, the principal commitments of His Holiness have also formed what I see as the basis for a non-Western decolonial epistemology along the lines of the ideas of Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekananda, as well as Gandhi. The fourth commitment of the Dalai Lama is linked to the formation of an alternative knowledge system. As a follower of the ancient Nalanda tradition, His Holiness is committed to foster a deeper appreciation of the values of ancient Indian knowledge and its academic incorporation as an academic subject in the modern educational institutes. His Holiness's commitments, which stems from his thought and religious philosophy, can be understood as forming a foundation for an alternative episteme regarding the world, one that is based on compassion, cooperation, and harmony. These ideas, in a way, run counter to the modern consumerist culture of competition and aggression. For instance, a case of a decolonial epistemology formulated by His Holiness is present in the importance that he gives to diversity and heterogeneity in human life. Such a narrative can be dubbed as a critique of the uniform, homogeneous principle that is embedded in the project of modernity, especially in the nation state. He gives importance to diversity in different religious traditions, which acts as a counter to the homogenization and radicality that is becoming common in all religions. Now, in conclusion, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's life is his legacy, which is an example of pure determination to do good that has been termed by him as universal responsibility. Through his numerous initiatives, he has attempted to foster this idea of universal responsibility among Tibetans in exile as well as among others. His life and legacy are an example of compassion in praxis. The success of the Tibetans in exile is a testament to this particular legacy. The effective administration of the government in exile, along with a democratic setup, provides an alternative to Tibetans under the PRC, where there is a lack of basic freedom. His Holiness is seen to be carrying forward the anti-colonial, decolonial legacy of leaders like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, as well as Nelson Mandela. He has crafted a unique anti-colonial discourse which is based on the principles of compassion and non-violence. Furthermore, he links the root of this discourse to ancient Buddhist philosophy, especially derived from the Nalanda masters, which were preserved by Tibetans in the Tibetan language. This anti-colonial discourse that emanates from His Holiness is one based on liberty, justice, and truth, which goes beyond the confines of the nation-state. And finally, in terms of reincarnation, it is extremely important to understand the legacy as well as the activities that has been conducted by the present reincarnation, because The idea of reincarnation is the next reincarnation, the future reincarnation will carry forward this particular legacy. So in that way, whatever activities His Holiness has been carrying forward throughout his life becomes a very, very important idea. Also, in this context, we need to understand that His Holiness has always emphasized that he will be, if he takes rebirth, it will be outside China or outside Tibet to a certain extent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive, excellent summary of the life and legacy of His Holiness. Thank you very much. And it now falls to our guest from afar, or not that far, still in the Finger Lakes area, Professor Alan Carlson of Cornell University, whose task it is to tell us who is next and why it matters so. So let me turn to Professor Carlson, please.
Great, thank you. Also, thank you everyone for accommodating me. I ended up coming down with the flu this week, and so it was pretty out of commission, and I'm still on a fair amount of cough medication, that sort of stuff, so God only knows what I'm going to say, but hopefully it'll make some positive contribution. I'll also start by noting that I am more of a China specialist by far than a Tibetologist. My study of China came from an interest in Tibet's relationship to China, but I stayed largely within the confines of kind of traditional sinology, particularly in the area of international relations, looking at great powers, U.S.-China relations, China's involvement in international organizations for about 20 years. 4 or 5 years ago, I shifted back to focusing more on Tibet in terms of language study and trying to catch up with the scholarship in the field, although my goodness, the presentations this morning were so diverse and so rich in their context that it really does feel like trying to follow up on something which can't be done. That being said, maybe as an outsider, I do have something to add in that I think some of the important underpinnings of this discussion have gone almost without being said, or at least have only been addressed indirectly in terms of talking about some of the sensitivities involved and the controversy that even holding a conference like this has generated apparently within Beijing and in Dharamsala as well. And so today what I'd like to do with my time is talk to you a bit about what I see as the major sort of vested interest in who's next. Again, perhaps it's a little bit obvious, but I think once we put the lineage in this broader context, I think it becomes more apparent what some of the sensitivities and controversies are, and arguably we begin treating the question of who's next as a policy issue, as opposed to one which is dictated solely by cultural norms and sensitivities or historical precedents. And alongside of that, I'll talk about the manner in which the Chinese narrative about reincarnation, reincarnates, or huohuo in the Chinese language, has shifted over the past 20 to 30 years through detailed examination of articles which have appeared in the China Academic Journals database. So it's really kind of 2 papers in one. Tendor, I assume I really pick up, I think, on some of the international context questions, and hopefully all together the panel will help generate a conversation which places what we've been talking about again in a broader context. I could start with a quote from His Holiness from 2019, where he talks about how long he's anticipating living, if it's 110 years or 113 years, maybe even 125. But I think what's maybe more blunt to the point is in 2022, a Radio New Zealand article started, it was titled, Everyone Dies, Even the Dalai Lama, which was then immediately followed by the wording, Tibet and China are racing for what happens next. That's what I'm looking at in this paper. And to telegraph the main findings of the paper, which I've put together for the panel, for the conference, The lineage stands as a linchpin within China's approach to Tibet and has great importance for China's relationship with the rest of the world. And the Chinese position on reincarnation since the 1990s has both expanded to cover ever more issues related to the selection process and hardened, placing ever greater constraints on the process and asserting that what would amount to total control over outcomes. Next slide, please. So why Tenzin Gyatso matters not only to Tibetans. I think there are 6 major actors involved here that all deserve some consideration when we're thinking about the politics around the selection process. Who will follow Tenzin Gyatso and how such a decision will be made is far from an academic exercise. It's one of tremendous import for both Tibet and the wider international system. Arguably, the question of who comes next is one of the least well-defined, yet most significant issues within the current China-Tibet relationship. Next slide. The importance of the Dalai Lama lineage to Tibetans inside and outside Tibet is self-evident. And we saw a lot of that this morning. We understand the reverence with which he's treated and considered. I would add that apart from all of these historical issues and cultural issues and religious issues, simply put, he's been the one constant in Tibetan life since the early 1950s, incorporation of Tibet into China. And to no small extent, over the course of the last several decades, the international Tibetan cause has become synonymous with Tenzin Gyatso. Both political leaders and celebrities have lined up to stand next to him for photo opportunities and to discuss both religious and secular matters. For a time in the 1990s, he helped make the Tibetan cause one of the most visible issues within the global discussion of protecting human rights. Indeed, it's difficult to imagine what the international campaign in support of Tibet would and could look like after the 14th Dalai Lama is no longer with us. So this centrality of Tenzin Gyatso has endured even though he stepped down from all his official political responsibilities in 2011. And he continues to stand at the epicenter of Tibetan life and the Tibetan struggle against Chinese rule. The reverence shown to him and the adoration he receives is of such a magnitude that Tibetans in general are reticent to even talk about the prospect of his passing away. Such deeply ingrained respect, while indicative of Tenzin Gyatso's illustrious status among Tibetans, also then make researching and writing about what will come after his passing a somewhat perilous endeavor, as it's very easy to be perceived as coming from a place of insufficient respect and understanding of just how venerable he is. Hopefully I'm not coming across that way right now, but it is something which is worthy of bringing into the conversation. This reverence is so pervasive among the Tibetans, and echoes of such respect are so omnipresent. And so much of the scholarship about the Dalai Lama is that it can be easy to overlook just how important Tenzin Gyatso is to non-Tibetans as well. Next slide. The lineage, and this is obviously Jiang Zemin and the Chinese, I'm not Jiang Zemin, Xi Jinping, and the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama. I think this was taken 2 or 3 years ago, the photo. The lineage is of great significance to China. The import is clear even without delving into the complex historical relationship we were talking about this morning. The TAR, established in 1966, encompasses 460,000 square miles, making it the second largest provincial unit within China, occupying more than 10% of the total landmass of the PRC, not including additionally predominantly ethnic Tibetan regions that lie outside the TAR itself. Moreover, this territory is of particular geopolitical import to China, both in terms of its relationship to India, which I'll speak about in a minute, and in regards to its source of natural resources, especially water. Given the reverence that's still shown to the Dalai Lama lineage throughout these lands, the question of who will be recognized as the reincarnation of Tenzin Gyatso is of clear import to China, even more so as he's been the only constant political figure in the history of the PRC. In terms of like an individual, during his lifetime, he's outlasted 5 Chinese leaders: Mao, Hua, Deng, Zhang, and Hu. Who knows if he'll outlast Xi Jinping? That's time will tell. So it's then no exaggeration to state the Dalai Lama, again, as a linchpin, not only in Tibetan society and religion, but also unwittingly in China's own vision and place in the world. Next slide. Who comes next also matters a great deal to India, the country that's been the host to Tenzin Gyatso ever since his flight from Tibet in 1959. currently home for over 100,000 Tibetan refugees. Given that India and China are shaping up as significant rivals in Asia, whatever happens to Tibet in general, and the Dalai Lama specifically, will have major geopolitical implications on the Asian continent. Tibet's place atop Asia gives China a significant strategic advantage over India, and moreover, the region itself is caught up in the still unresolved and contentious Sino-Indian border dispute. Thus, whatever happens regarding who replaces him, if the selection process becomes contentious, it will rock the already difficult relationship between the two Asian giants. India, and we could talk about this more in the Q&A, could then attempt to tip the scales in the selection process, either towards Beijing or Dharamsala. The United States also has vested interest in how things will unfold. I think here the question, though, beyond the acts, like the 2002 Tibet Policy Act and the 2020 Tibet Policy Support Act, which clearly articulated the U.S. stance on the institution of the Dalai Lama. I think the most pertinent, largely unspoken question here is if the U.S. ever had, and more poignantly, if it has now, any actual leverage over Beijing when it comes to Tibet in general, and the Dalai Lama more specifically. Next slide. And then finally, what unfolds will also show how much human rights and religious freedoms are observed and protected within the current international order, and whether the international community, and particularly the UN, has the political will and capacity to press for their preservation in places like the PRC. We know that this sort of weak cooperation fell apart between 1989 and 1995, and particularly 95, around the selection of the 11th Panchen Lama. This was the first time I was in Beijing at that time and watched CCTV coverage of China's selection of the Panchen Lama and throne ceremony at the Jokang Temple in Lhasa. It was then that I also first became aware of the Sarbum, or Jinping, the Golden Urn lot drawing ceremony. That being said, it was in 2007 with the passage of the Zhangchuan Huojiao Huofuo Zhuan Shi Guanli Danfa, or the Measures in the Management of the Reincarnation of Living Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, or MMR for short, that China really began to put a specific emphasis on how reincarnation would be affected. As noted in 2017 by Kuzmin, the law for reincarnates is designed, quote, is designed to put this institution under strict control of the Chinese state. It contradicts Buddhism and historical traditions. The system introduces new criteria and methods for recognizing Turkus, appealing to the need to adopt Tibetan Buddhism to the society that that is built by the CPC, by the Chinese Communist Party. The MMR was a clear turn toward tightening the screws in China's assertion of control over the particulars of reincarnation selection. Next slide. I did a search of the entire database of Zhangchuan Huojiao Huofuo Zhuan Shi, or the reincarnation of living Buddhists in Tibetan Buddhism. I did this first, next slide, using the fuzzy parameters of the search and any time that the term appeared in this database, and came up with 2,606 articles, which are shown here on their annual distribution. Given that that was a number of articles that was impossible to really dig into, next slide, I turned to looking more specifically at keywords and article titles. And then finally, on the next slide, just looking at articles that had the title Zhuangchuan Huojiao Huofuo Zhuan Shi in them. It's interesting to note that in 1989, in the previous slide, there were 10 articles. In 1995, 10 had been published as well. In 2011, there was another 8. In 2014, 12. The numbers were smaller for those with specific titles. Of these 21 articles, I focused on 5 in particular. The first that appeared in 1989 and was entitled Tibetan Buddhism and the Establishment of the Reincarnation System of the Pancha Living Buddha, which is not a great translation, but works. What's interesting about this early article is it didn't place such a great emphasis on Chinese sovereignty or on the Golden Urn itself. Instead, it talked about the interaction between the two lineages and the extent to which it was a cooperative relationship dating back to Tsongkhapa, if we think about the earlier examples here. The second article was published in 1998 and had a very different tone. Its title was Research on the System of Living Buddhas in Tibetan Buddhism. The article stands out for the volume of citations it had, 15, and downloads over 1,000. It contrasted sharply with the 1989 article, as the golden urn was introduced early and often in text, and emphasized the use of drawing lots was needed due to the instability and corruption that had crept into the selection process of incarnate lineages during the Qing dynasty. Third article was from 2013 and was titled "The Reincarnation of Living Buddhas in Tibetan Buddhism," and was published in Zhongguo Zangshui, and provided a broad overview of the evolution of the tradition of reincarnates in Tibetan Buddhism. It contained the most detailed and thorough treatment of the tradition that I found in this collection of articles, going into the history and development of specific lineages, specifically noting, quote, historically the central authorities and local governments place a high level of importance on the reincarnation of living Buddhas, and then managing it developed a complete set of historical outcomes. It also noted, this is the 2013 article, and then I know just by that time, so I'll go quickly to the final article, that the golden urn was not always used, but when it was not used, it was because of, quote, special approval from the central government. In 2020, there were a cluster of articles with living Buddhas, the reincarnate living Buddhas, in their titles. The one which stands out the most was written by Jigme on the central authority of the implementation of living Buddha reincarnation system in Tibetan Buddhism. Here, we see the transformation of the Chinese narrative rather completely, moving from consideration of a cooperative set of relations between the center and Tibetan authorities, to an assertion that the golden urn itself and control over the reincarnation selection process is consonant with and a proof of Chinese sovereignty over the Tibetan region. The final lines of the article note, quote, the central government has the power to maintain the reincarnation system of living Buddhas in Tibetan Buddhism and to appoint and abolish reincarnated living Buddhas, which shows that the Chinese central government exercises sovereignty over the Tibetan region. Alongside of this research, I also looked at a webpage maintained by Zhongguo Zangshui and Zhou or the China Tibenology Research Center, which is dedicated to Zhengzhi Zhangtuan Huojiao Zhongguo Hua, or promoting the synthesization of Tibetan Buddhism. There were 85 articles in total on the page at the time I wrote my paper. I won't go into more detail about the substance of these articles, except to note that they resonate quite a bit with what the longer series of articles which I was researching in the China Academic Journals database. Finally, just to conclude, next slide now. I think the politics then are clear in that given how China has stated its position on how reincarnation will occur and that it has all authority over it, that it's rather essential for those considering who will come next to develop novel approaches to this reincarnation selection process. In 2011, His Holiness did this in his own lineage, including the tradition of Moderator or emanation before death. This remains a somewhat controversial issue within the Tibetan community, but I think it's one that would potentially put the Tibetans more in the driver's seat when it comes to the eventual selections which need to be made. That's it for me. Thank you very much. And again, sorry for having to zoom in for.
Thank you very much. And we hope that the subsequent discussion will make you feel better and speed your recovery. So let us turn now to Tenzin Dorjee from the Department of Political Science at Columbia and senior researcher and strategist at the Tibet Action Institute.
I want to ask you, can you name one leader who has been criticized and attacked by a regime more than the Dalai Lama has been attacked and criticized by the CCP? Can anyone name one leader, one such leader? I thought so. It's hard. It's hard to come up with somebody.
You have an answer.
We'll try. maybe it doesn't approach the same level, I think. The reason I ask this is, for the last 60 years, Beijing has attacked the Dalai Lama as a person, as an institution, as a lineage. So why does it want him to reincarnate now? Why is CCP so persistent and insistent that Dalai Lama has to reincarnate? Can you hear me? And I know it's obviously about power, but focusing on power exclusively can make us unable to see the complexities of what's at stake. And I believe that there are not only geopolitical stakes, but civilizational stakes in this conflict. To outline the stakes, I want to highlight the gap between what the Tibetan people want and what the Chinese government wants. For Beijing, the Dalai Lama's reincarnation is a game of realpolitik. It's a game of sabotage. It's a geopolitical game of thrones. But for Tibetans, it's a matter of life and death and rebirth. And the reason I say that is because Tibetans really believe in rebirth and reincarnation. The vast majority of Tibetans really believe in that. And yesterday, Janet said Tibetans invented the reincarnation system. We could give that credit to the Tibetans. A more cynical person might say that Tibetans invented the reincarnation industrial complex. But the point is that while the abstract theory of rebirth emerged in India, the concrete practice of recognizing reincarnations emerged in Tibet. There is no doubt about that. And that made me think of something that Tocqueville said about America. He said, the genius of the American founding fathers is that they took the liberal political theory of British philosophers and they rescued it from the abstract realm of philosophy and created a real political experiment in this new country. And I think we could claim that Tibetans did something similar to Indian religious theory of rebirth. Now, in any discussion on the Sino-Tibetan conflict, there is a general impression that Tibetans and Chinese don't agree on anything. It's very hard to find common ground. But that's not always the case. That's not always true, because right now on this subject, there is one area where both sides seem to agree on, if we take at face value what China is saying. Both sides want the Dalai Lama lineage to continue. The bad news is that's pretty much where the agreement ends. Because even though both sides want the same thing, each side has very different reasons. When Tibetans say they want the lineage to continue, the reason is very obvious. The Dalai Lama is at the center of Tibetan faith, identity, individual and collective identity. Metaphorically, Tibetan Buddhism without the Dalai Lama is like Catholicism without the Pope. But analytically, there are two informal roles. I think there are two informal roles that make the Dalai Lama uniquely important. One is meaning-making, his meaning-making function, and the other is his mobilizing power. Now let's look at meaning-making. In 2009, I just want to share a personal story. In 2009, there was a campaign called the No Losar campaign in Tibet and in the diaspora. And it was basically meant to mourn, suspend the Losar Tibetan New Year celebrations in order to mourn those who died in the 2008 uprising. This was a successful campaign. The next year, in 2010, again, some people tried to revive the same campaign and asked people to cancel Losar again. And this time I was in DC at a friend's house, and my friend had an elderly aunt who was very old, in her 90s. And while we were talking, the aunt said, but what do you mean no Losar? We cannot cancel Losar. We have to celebrate Losar, she said. And the reason was, she said, because His Holiness is still with us. For her, as long as the Dalai Lama is present, there is reason to go on with life and living. Another example, a very famous example, Palden Gyatso. He was a political prisoner for 33 years. He passed away a few years ago. In his autobiography, Fire Under the Snow, he describes the moment right before his audience with the Dalai Lama. He says how, like all Tibetans, he too had imagined this moment 1,000 times in his head, all through the years he was in prison. And you can see in that description, you can see how his devotion to the Dalai Lama is at the center of what gives meaning to his existence and a sense of purpose to all of his suffering, losses, deprivation, and persecution. Another political prisoner that I've met and spoken with many times is this guy called Gyatso, who lives in Switzerland. And he told me he was a political prisoner for 5 years, and he told me the same thing. When he was in prison, when he hit his lowest moments in prison, he would visualize His Holiness. And all of a sudden, that would give him the purpose he needed to go on, to keep going. So when you hear more and more of these stories from all types of people, not just political people, just like ordinary citizens, apolitical people, every type, you begin to understand why thousands of people cross the Himalayas just to see His Holiness once in their lifetime. And in an age of disenchantment, where there is a global crisis of meaning, the Dalai Lama continues to be an inexhaustible source of meaning. However, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't really care about the meaning-making side of the Dalai Lama's role. What Beijing cares about is the mobilizing power of the Dalai Lama. And the creation of meaning, which occurs at the individual level, largely at the individual level, doesn't pose a direct threat to China's political stability or its national security. But the power to mobilize people, mobilize thousands of people, that is what keeps dictators up at night, right? And the Dalai Lama possesses an unimaginably vast, deep, and inexhaustible reserve of latent mobilizing power. If he wanted, he could make Tibet ungovernable. But he has rarely activated that power, except on a handful of occasions. I'll give you one example. In the early 2000s in Tibet, there was a fashion trend. It became very fashionable to wear tiger skin and leopard pelts. People might remember that era, right? Tibetans would wear, put it on their chuba. This expensive fashion was hurting the wildlife in India, where poachers were hunting big game with the Tibetan market, black market in mind. So Indian activists informed the Dalai Lama about this problem, and then in 2006, at a religious teaching in Amravati, His Holiness made a short statement at the end of his teaching. He spoke directly to Tibetans inside Tibet, saying they should stop wearing animal skin. He basically said, cut it out, guys, In less than a month, a campaign emerged in Tibet. Tibetans were gathering in town squares, bringing out all of their tiger skin, leopard pelts, all type of clothing like that, and setting them on fire. They were burning literally tens of thousands of dollars worth of goods, but they were doing it with a disruptive kind of joy and celebration. This was a chance to show their allegiance to the leader through this highly visible action. And overnight, Tibetans really stopped wearing animal skin right after that. You can look at the number of tiger population increase. But if he wanted to, the Dalai Lama's mobilizing power could really make Tibet ungovernable for Beijing. Let me give you another example of a different type, okay? After 2008, in a series of speeches, His Holiness mentioned, almost in passing, that Tibetan population is too small. He kind of complained that our population is too small. And he basically said people need to take action. I remember thinking at the time, that's a tough call to respond to, right? Because so many variables need to come together for that. It's one thing to throw your clothes on the fire. It's one thing to join a street protest, because you get it done right away. But to bring a whole new human being into this world, and then to put up with that person for the rest of their lives, like that's another level of dedication and sacrifice and commitment. And we all see that, CCP and Xi Jinping, they're trying to do that now. They're trying to encourage people to have more kids. They have pro-natalist policies, right? They're saying, forget about the one-child policy. Now we have two-child policy, three-child policy, but nobody's responding, right? What happened? In Tibet, the people responded to the Dalai Lama's call. Around 2009 and 10, the word spread in Tibet. The word on the street was that His Holiness wants us to work harder in the reproduction industry. And women in their 30s and 40s, they really, they just rolled up their sleeves and went on to have more children, like with help from their partners, of course. I know this because a friend who visited Tibet recently said they met a doctor who said, he or she, right, said with great pride that they were directly involved in the delivery of nearly 1,000 children in Lhasa. Now, we are beginning to see demographic scholars who are now noting that there is a surprising, unexpected mini baby boom in Tibet between 2010 and 15. Now, this is the Dalai Lama's unparalleled latent mobilizing power. It's latent because he rarely activates it, but it's there, this vast reserve of latent mobilizing power, which will likely be available to a legitimate 15th Dalai Lama in the future. And he will have the ability to transform domestic politics, even tip the balance of power, geopolitical power in the future, in a future conflict in the Himalayas between, hypothetically, India and China, or in a future Cold War 2.0 between China and the US. That's why not just both sides, Tibetans and Chinese, but all sides should care about the mobilizing power of the Dalai Lama. And earlier I said that the CCP doesn't care about the Dalai Lama's meaning-making function, but it does very much care about his legitimating function, right? Regime legitimating function. And there is an important reason. A typical regime has 3 routes to legitimation. One is through the ballot box, democratic elections. The second is revolutionary legitimacy, by winning wars, in the case of CCP, winning the civil war against Kuomintang and winning the decolonization struggle against Japan. That's revolutionary legitimacy. And the third is performance legitimacy, right? Now, we know that China cannot access the first route to legitimacy because it's not democratic. The second route to legitimacy, revolutionary legitimacy, it gets old. It works for 1 generation, for 2 generations maybe. By the 3rd and the 4th generation, that legitimacy, which is based in a historical moment, it starts to erode. But the last couple of decades, China's main source of legitimacy, the CCP's main source, has been performance legitimacy, right, through economic development. But now that type of legitimacy in China is beginning to look a little bit shaky. So for Beijing, the legitimacy problem is, as much as it's great in mainland China, it's even greater in Tibet, because Tibetan people view the Chinese regime not just as illegitimate, but as colonial. In mainland China, if we can say hypothetically tomorrow, the CCP, after failing all 3 routes to legitimacy, if we can say CCP has 0 legitimacy, we can say in Tibet, CCP has negative legitimacy, right? But by contrast, the Dalai Lama doesn't need to win elections or fight wars or improve the economy in order to retain legitimacy or to create legitimacy. He needs neither the ballot box nor the golden urn, because he has something nobody has, and that is the ability to create meaning. He's the meaning maker in chief. So if the CCP has negative legitimacy, I think we can say the Dalai Lama has, I think we can only describe it as surplus legitimacy, right? And maybe that's arguably what Beijing thinks it can borrow from the lineage in the future, if it can control, if there comes a time, doubly hypothetically, when Beijing can control and groom the 15th Dalai Lama. That's all. Thank you.
And thank you very, very much for setting us right up to the current moment of political choice on the Chinese side. So let us now, we have a full half hour for questions and answers. And Professor Carlson, you're still with us. Thank you so much. So the floor is open if individuals would identify themselves and ask, and we'll start right away. Yes, sir.
This is Aoife from Asia Center. I'm a Buddhist nun from Taiwan, not from PRC. Okay. Well, I'd like to offer kind of a from non-Tibetan Buddhist tradition to look at this reincarnation of Dalai Lama's issue. Well, as we all know that in the Theravada tradition or the Han tradition, the Han Chuan Fojiao, the Sinitic in the Buddhist tradition, there was no reincarnation of guru. So definitely this reincarnation of Panchen or Lama, it's very unique in the Tibetan tradition. And then this morning we all talking about all this background, and especially to do with the either it's more like a political. For me, it looks like a more political implication rather than religion, because I think that the reincarnation of Dalai Lama is very important for especially the exile government. That's the way I understand. So, but here I have a question I'd really like to ask. Is it ever like a Dalai Lama make a statement? Have you ever thinking about like abolish this reincarnation? Because sometimes in the media, they will sometimes say, well, he claimed, in the past he claimed to abolish this reincarnation. Did he ever make us, okay, I'm not coming back? Okay, the secondly, I think that I myself have a kind of criticized about this reincarnation system. The first one, I think that it's not very healthy for a child education. Thinking about like those are picked up by as a candidate, and their education is not very normal. And also, I think the honor or title should be earned through the marriage. But right now we have all this reincarnation of, Kamapa or Hofo, living Buddha. And it just, the people just toward this title assume they are like a saint. But we also know that there are some kind of scandal among these reincarnation guru as well. So, and then the other issue is, even though you pick up a 15 Dalai Lama, then, it will be baby. And then you also have 18 years or 20 years, the vacancy. There was no Dalai Lama at all. And so it kind of reminds us about like in Chinese imperialism that you have a like child emperor, then you have the supervisor for the country. So this is all kind of my criticism on this system. Thank you.
It sounds like you're criticizing both sides then at the moment. Yeah. Any comments? I'll go first.
Thank you so much for the. I think His Holiness has on several occasions raised the possibility that there might be no 15th reincarnation, 15th Dalai Lama. And he has floated a number of different possibilities, right? And we are all familiar with the diversity, the huge range of possibilities that he has kind of painted. And I do think, there is a great credibility to the point that you make. Even among Tibetans, there are people who feel that the reincarnation system, the Tulku system in general, is a system that is liable to become corrupt quite easily. And as much as it has brought the Tibetan civilization and the Tibetan political community a lot of great things, there are a number of different flaws with the system. But I think the biggest problem right now is, I think, if the Tibetan people had been left to their own device, and if they had had the freedom to make the type of reforms that they would have wanted to make, I think the chances are great that there would have been lots of major reforms already have taken place in the religious reincarnation system. But the fact that there is a colonial relationship with China right now, it creates a situation where the colonized subject doesn't really have the freedom to reform itself, because the colonial ceiling is always there. And even right now, a number of Tibetans that I've interviewed, their number one kind of preference is, okay, ideally we would love to have one legitimate Dalai Lama in the 15th incarnation, but China, what will China do? That's always a big question that's hanging. And with His Holiness, if he decides that there is no next Dalai Lama, chances are that the Chinese government will still come up with a Dalai Lama. And that kind of ruins the benefits or the intended goal of why there was going to be no Dalai Lama in the first place, to reform the reincarnation system. So I think that's the factor that makes everything much more complicated.
Yeah, I agree with whatever Dorjee is saying, as mentioned. Also, His Holiness, I guess in one of the interviews that I was listening to by His Holiness, did mention about the fact that in the past he saw this whole system as a kind of a feudal practice that remained, and that changes needs to be brought about to this particular system. In fact, in my presentation I was emphasizing that even inside Tibet, when he was there, he did try to bring about numerous reforms. Of course, those reforms were either stalled by the monastic aristocratic group or by the CCP. But then reincarnation itself is it's a unique Tibetan Buddhist phenomenon. And as you mentioned, you brought about Theravada Buddhism. I'm not really an expert, I'm not a student, neither am I a scholar of religion. I mostly focus on political science or international relations, but the little knowledge that I know is this idea of reincarnation, I guess, comes mostly from Tantric Buddhism, one way or the other. So, and we are strongly influenced by Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism. So in that way it is borrowed from these practices. Thank you.
Professor Carlson, any comment? Don't need to, unless you wish. Yeah.
No, briefly, and to pick up on what Tendor was saying in response to the question and also during your presentation, and particularly because your question is coming from someone from Taiwan. It's interesting because one could conceive of Xi perhaps reversing course the more coercive policy measures which have been put in place, and reaching out to engage in dialogue with Dharamsala, with the Tibetans in exile over the eventual selection of the 15th, in which case they take would garner potentially more legitimacy, not only within the Tibetan community, but also across the Taiwan Straits as well. Again, there's no evidence to suggest that she is heading in that direction, but it would be a kind of novel solution to where things stand, where they appear to be headed.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please. And actually, to whom do you?
Hi, I'm Dibyesh Anand from University of Westminster, London. So question, very quick one for Tenzin. You mentioned about the demographic change possibly in last few years because of possibly Dalai Lama's advice inside Tibet. Is there similar baby boom in exile? If not, why not? And Jigme, again, could you expand? So I agree with you in terms of course, the legacy and the life of His Holiness the Lama. Could you connect it more to the wider theme of the geopolitics? So what is the significance in terms of geopolitics? Are there other areas you wanted to cover but you couldn't cover in 15 minutes? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dibesh. I think, in exile, the numbers are much harder to track because people are all over the place. So there isn't, people are no longer in the settlements as they used to live in. And I think there potentially would have been a baby boom. And if not, the reason probably would be that the trend or the direction would have been offset by the people's migration to the West in large numbers. And migration always goes against demographic increase. So I think I would point to that one.
Okay, thank you, Dibesh. With regard to the wider impact in geopolitics, I guess Professor Carlson has also emphasized on that. But then also with regard to Sino-India relationship, what we see is recently an article came out by a former Foreign Secretary, and specifically on Foreign Secretary of India, specifically on the reincarnation of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, like what next. And in that he spells out how in the near future, in a post-Dalai Lama scenario, if there is no Dalai Lama or if there is a 15th Dalai Lama chosen by the Chinese, then what will happen to the Tibetans in exile? So, and what will be the responsibility of the Indians? What are the stakes for India with regard to the reincarnation? So, in that way, I guess geopolitically, the reincarnation issue becomes highly important, extremely significant. But more importantly, if you see, His Holiness has immense legitimacy, immense faith, devotion among the people living, the communities, different communities all across the Himalayas, whether it is from Ladakh all the way to Mintawang. So in that way also, what will be the impact on them? That needs to be understood, like geopolitically. With regard to reincarnation, this is slightly different, but then there's this other country that has laws on reincarnation, which is Bhutan, with regard to the Shabdrum, right? So in that way also, I guess more research needs to be done regarding this.
Thank you. Other questions? Here in the far back, if you would stand, identify yourself, and to whom, which of our panelists would you like to ask a question, please?
I guess it can be addressed to any of you, but my name is Brendan Tran. I'm an undergrad at Boston University studying philosophy and psychology, so I am very interested in religion. But since we're on the topic of the Dalai Lama, I know we're focused on that, but since we're interested in reincarnation in Buddhism, does anyone know anything about like the future Buddha prophecies and stuff?
Whoa. That's beyond me.
That's for the morning panel, I think.
Yeah.
I think. But we'll go. Did we record the morning panel? Okay, so you come talk to them after. Deb, can you answer that in 1 minute? Okay. But thank you. Thank you for. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Please, on this side.
Yeah. Have I got that on? Yes, I have. Okay. I guess I got a question here, and it comes from many of the discussions that have happened here. Is there a danger we're falling victim here somewhat to what Thomas Carlyle once called great man theory? You know, the idea that all of this is done by one figure. I mean, in the end of the day, what you spoke about with reference to His Holiness is something that exists in the relationship between the Tibetan people and His Holiness. You know, guru devotion is carried out by disciples. And I guess that raises the sort of larger question, which isn't how much of this is done by a future 15th Dalai Lama or this Dalai Lama, but by Tibetans themselves. You know, if I mean, one of the points we were looking at that you and I were discussing actually earlier, which was that the incarnate tradition is largely a bottom-up tradition. It isn't dictated by laws traditionally. It was dictated by institutions and labrangs agreeing upwards that they've recognized an incarnate. You know, the tradition of incarnations was, sorry, it's a rather long point. The tradition of incarnations was that an incarnate like His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, effectively brought Tibetan culture and Tibetan religion nearly single-handedly to the world and to the exiled community. But traditionally, of course, when a reincarnation happens, those gifts are given back to the next reincarnation. So I guess the question here for a future is not what happens, what a 15th Dalai Lama does or does not do. It is what the Tibetans do to give that back to that incarnation.
Also not an easy question. Any comment?
I'll let him comment.
Yeah, that's really difficult to answer, I guess. But then, I don't know, like, yeah, absolutely. It's a two-way process, I guess. Because in this, His Holiness, like, especially not only the Tibetans, but of course, Tibetans are not, the Dalai Lama is a Tibetan, right, first and foremost. But also more importantly, you have a lot of these Himalayan communities that I was mentioning who have this utmost devotion to His Holiness. And this was specifically seen when there was this controversy in the Indian media. So all along the Himalayas, whether from Ladakh, Darjeeling, Gangtok to Myeongtaung, people came out. And these were not your Buddhists who were coming out. They were like the local communities who were coming out in support of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. So that itself is something remarkable, I guess. And over there, like, so regarding the 15th reincarnation, what is the relationship of these communities to the 15th? So that way, maybe, of course, as you are saying, what Martin is saying, from the people to the reincarnate. So that relationship is being created, and His Holiness has also emphasized that the Himalayan communities are also in somewhat have to be kept in the loop regarding his future reincarnation.
And if I can add really quickly to Martin's great man theory understanding of what happens, the relationship between the Tibetan public and the Dalai Lama. I think I would agree with you that at the stage of emergence, at the stage when somebody is coming up as a child, I do think the initiative and the energy and the legitimation and the power often flow from the bottom to the top, right? We create that. But once the public has invested its energy and its wisdom and knowledge and authority in that one person, and even though that one person may have been an ordinary person when they were young, once they attain majority and they become a full adult as a leader, once they assume authority, I do think the type of person that they are can actually make a lot of difference to how things go. And they can actually, one type of great man can shape history in this way, another type of great man fails to shape history in a particular way. So I do think they do become important actors who can sometimes dominate not only history but the masses and society itself. The balance can actually shift like this. But then at the same time, when the time of transition comes to the next rebirth, once again the public begins to play a more important role. So I think there is something relative that goes up and down maybe.
Tony, did you want to offer a medical perspective?
No, I have.
Oh, I'm sorry, Janet. Yeah.
I want to agree, actually, with everything that's been said back and forth. I think it is a two-way street, but it is important to look from the bottom up. I want to, first of all, respond to Aoife's, one of your critiques about the scandals that have come up and questions about the training of the tulkus and their life. It's a complicated question. It's not only tulkus, but I just went to a conference a couple of weeks ago on sexual abuse in Buddhism across the Buddhist world, not necessarily about tulkus, but the monastic system more generally. And we can also talk about religion across the board, because religion is rife with scandals. And even if we didn't have religion, I think we've got lots of secular people who are involved in scandals as well. And so it's not an easy fix. I do want to make a case, and it sort of goes after Tendor's comments about the raising of tulkus. And of course, there's many, many tulkus, and it varies widely. But there is a fascinating and really highly developed culture by which this young person is raised in a context with exceptional people who raise the child up to think of themselves as a reincarnation. Something happens in the formation of their character and their virtues. If you look at Tibetan history, we do have many examples of, going back in history for hundreds of years, extraordinary leaders. We have lots of tulkus who intervened, for example, between warring parties, great intellectuals, great leaders in a variety of ways. I think when done well, and that's, of course, an important criteria, when it's done well, the tulku system is a really interesting alternative model of raising children, of raising leaders, of inculcating a certain kind of virtue and a certain kind of self-conception. If you really are raised to think of yourself as Avalokiteshvara, as a bodhisattva, something happens to you. And not every tulku steps up to the plate, but some of them do. So I wouldn't want to necessarily rule it out altogether. So that's my comment.
Thank you.
My question is for Tendola, I should say Dr. Tendola. I'm really intrigued by your model, and particularly the performance legitimacy being the project of the CCP in the rebirth of His Holiness. And I felt like it was particularly aimed at the Tibetan community, but I wanted you to elaborate a little bit, reflecting on how that might affect mainland China and mainland Chinese. In particular, I'm thinking about the tremendous transition of mainland Chinese seeking lamas as their teachers, Larungar being a really great example, sort of Lodutai, but also all over the plateau, and what that project also might mean for maybe a broader community.
Actually, I would suggest, so there are many other people here who are much more well-versed in the historical aspect of the legitimation relationship between Tibetan Lamas and Chinese emperors, or Tibetan Lamas and Manchu emperors, Tibetan Lamas and the Ming, Tibetan Lamas and the Mongol Yuan emperors, right? So I think that goes back very far, and all I would say is, yeah, I do think the CCP is kind of a aberration when it comes to, if you think about how the CCP being avowedly atheist from its very founding began to attack religion in a certain way, and especially Buddhism in a certain way. But even then, Tibetans do hear about how right now there are lamas in Tibet, some of whom count among their disciples some extremely important Chinese figures, political figures, right, hugely. And there are also interesting anecdotes we hear about, was it Gyatso or some of the retired top brass CCP members? They are publicly atheists all of their life, but when they die, their family sends a request to Dharamsala for the Dalai Lama to pray for them. So I think there is, a really interesting connection in that sense. But in terms of in the area of legitimation, if Xi Jinping goes the way, if the three legs of legitimacy for the CCP right now, they crumble, it does seem like Xi Jinping is going for full-on dictatorial powers, and in the future, if that comes to be a particular type of scenario, it's hard not to imagine the possibility that in his mind he may be thinking of looking to the history of the Manchu Qing era and how the Manchu emperors legitimated themselves when the Yongle or a particular Manchu emperor usurped power and come to power. What tactics did they use to legitimate their empire and rule at that time? And if he may not be drawing lessons from those kind of stories.
Well, let me just turn the question. I wonder if when Xi Jinping passes to the great beyond, that he will be buried like the Qianlong emperor in a tomb in which there will be Buddhist sutras on the ceiling in two languages, Sanskrit and Tibetan. I doubt it, but we shall. So I have a question for as we're to look at the geopolitics of this, which are not just or even primarily international, but broadly across the Tibetan plateau to Beijing and India. If it is true that there had been an agreement for the choice of the 11th Panchen Lama that came askew because of the way in which the announcement was handled. I mean, that's at least what I've been told by some. I don't know that I have no proof. It shows a capacity or a willingness on the part of some in Beijing to work together, and later that policy that will have changed in that particular instance. There are at least some hints of divided councils in Beijing about what to do in this circumstance. If you that comment by Yu Zhengsheng that I mentioned when he was in Lhasa, that the passing of the Dalai Lama that's the only test as to whether their policies will have worked or not worked, or the commentary by Jinwei and critique of others of China's Tibetan policy. What are the prospects for some form of compromise, or what are the prospects for something to not end up with the dual legitimization battles, or with others that would, were they successful, might massively enhance the prestige of the person chosen to be the next Dalai Lama, but also of China's legitimacy over this territory. I don't know, Professor Carlson, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I was considering and thinking about the various actors that have a stake in the game, and that all indications are, when we look at Chinese policy and the Chinese narrative, over the past 20 plus years, going back to the 1995 appointment of the Chinese appointment of the Panchen Lama. All indicators are that there isn't a lot of room for compromise. There isn't a lot of room for change. But it does strike me that if Beijing was willing to take the risk of working with the Tibetan community outside of Tibet, or outside of China, that this could again have a lot of positive knock-on effects in terms of China's international image. Arguably, in terms of geopolitics, including India and us having India on board, perhaps also even leading to some sort of a resolution or at least a step forward in the Sino-Indian border dispute. Once more, though, recent developments tend to cut against the grain of such a optimistic scenario, but it is one that could be considered. And just to throw in an additional wild card, we now have President-elect Trump, who will be in office in January 20th, and who knows what that might lead to in terms of broader patterns of U.S.-China relations, let alone what's going on in regards to the relationship between Dharamsala and Beijing.
Thank you very much. Lapsang, please.
Regarding compromise, there was an opportunity when the selection committee recognized by the Chinese government of Dashlumpo Monastery nominated of the three candidates as the real Panchen Lama.
Yes.
And the Lama did announce the boy as the Panchen Lama. Now Chinese government had a golden opportunity because they had the physical person in their hands. Had they endorsed him and say, yes, he is the Panchen Lama, Chinese government could have gotten the Panchen Lama, recognized the Dalai Lama, and will be selecting the next Dalai Lama. No. Now they messed up. They said, nope, he's the fake one, and we choose our one, right? So,
but did they do that simply because the Dalai Lama chose the other one?
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Now, that could be a compromise. When Dalai Lama recognized the Panchen Lama, but the Chinese government had the Panchen Lama in their hands. So they could have groomed him, trained him, and then this Panchen Lama, when he selects the 15th Dalai Lama, Tibetans in exile, everybody could have less legitimacy to challenge that Dalai Lama.
Of course.
Right? There was a compromise at that time. But then Beijing said, no, we're going to choose our own. Now we call this, the Chinese chosen one, a fake Panchen Lama. Right. Now we have a very good, simple narrative. Fake Panchen Lama chooses fake Dalai Lama, and the real Dalai Lama, gives us a directive as to select the, next real Dalai Lama. So they lost that opportunity. So that was, a compromise.
And you think there's no lesson that they could learn from this?
Now, yes, I think the Dalai Lama gives a directive, and Beijing says, yes, that directive is good, but the Dalai Lama will be outside China. That's their loss.
Okay. Well, it's a fascinating case. I'm glad we've been able to solve this this afternoon. I'll never, some of you will know, Janet will remember, and Michael will remember, we once had a gentleman who wanted to promote Buddhist studies at Harvard and elsewhere, who said to me, this is in 2011, that he was so excited about this prospect for this moment for Tibetan Buddhism because, and he said it in a big whisper, Xi Jinping is a secret Buddhist, and he's going to bring back the Dalai Lama. He's been very secret about it so far, but if his term keeps extending, who knows? Anyway, thank you. And I want to send a personal thanks to Lapsang Sangay for helping to mobilize this entire enterprise and for his personal invitation to me to be part of it. It's a pleasure and an honor for us to have the, how shall we put it, the Sikyong Emeritus here with us at Harvard. So thank you very much. And we are at break time, 15 minutes. Thank you so much. Professor Carlson, thank you so much. I hope you feel better.
Oh, yeah.